The spruce beam, 60 feet long and 2 feet thick, resisted. It scraped over the volcanic scree with the sound of a giant's sharpening stone, leaving a pale groove in the dark earth. Kalen leaned into the harness, his shoulders burning, the muscles in his back cording into ridges of solid pain. Each step was a victory of inches. Behind him, the mouth of the lava tube gaped, a cool, silent exhalation of ancient air that promised relief from the late summer sun. He felt the subtle shift as the beam's center of gravity passed the lip of the entrance, and with a final, groaning heave, the timber slid forward, its front half disappearing into the blackness. Kalen collapsed against the rough bark, his chest heaving. A wet nose nudged his hand. Cinder, his gray-furred companion, sat patiently, his intelligent eyes fixed on the dark opening, a low whine of anticipation in his throat. He was never afraid of the dark. Kalen ran a hand over the dog's head, his gaze following the length of the beam into the cave. It was the first of 200. This was his home now. He slid the harness from his shoulders, the leather darkened with sweat, and walked to the edge. The air that flowed out was a constant 54 degrees, a blessing in the heat and a promise of sanctuary in the winter. He took a breath of it, the scent of damp stone and deep earth filling his lungs. It was the smell of safety. "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen." The voice came from the path below. Mr. Thorne stood there, his hands on his hips, his face a mask of weathered disbelief. He was a man made of leather and skepticism, his farm in the valley below a testament to conventional wisdom and hard, predictable work. He gestured with his chin toward the cave. "You dragging timber into a hole in the ground? What for, boy? The mountain spirits need a new fence?" Kalen looked at the old farmer, then back at the beam. He didn't have the words or the desire for a long explanation. "I'm building," he said. His voice was quiet, unused to conversation. "Building what? A tomb?" Thorne shook his head, a dry chuckle catching in his throat. "Your folks filled your head with all sorts of nonsense from those books of theirs, but this is a new kind of foolish. That hole will be a damp, dark grave come winter. You'll freeze or drown in the melt, mark my words." Kalen picked up a length of rope, his calloused fingers coiling it with practiced efficiency. "It'll be warm," he stated, not as an argument, but as a fact. "The earth keeps it warm." "The earth keeps a corpse warm, too," Thorne scoffed, turning to leave. "Wait until the first snow. Wait until you hear the wolves howling and you're trapped in the dark with the drips and the echoes. You'll come begging for a spot by a proper fire." Kalen watched him go, his silhouette shrinking against the vast green valley. He felt no anger, only a quiet resolve that settled deeper into his bones. He had the journals. He had the knowledge his parents had left him, meticulously recorded observations of the mountain's cycles, its subtle breathing, its long, slow pulse. They had seen the patterns the valley dwellers ignored. They had charted the seismic whispers and the changing gases from the summit's fumaroles. And they had written, in clear, steady script, about the great tubes as natural shelters, impervious to the fire above or the long cold that always followed. Cinder nudged his hand again, as if to say the man was gone and the work remained. Kalen gave the dog a grateful look. "He doesn't understand," he murmured, "but we do." He spent the rest of the afternoon rigging a block and tackle to a sturdy overhang inside the tube's entrance. The mechanics of it were a comfort, a puzzle of physics and force that made sense. He anchored the ropes to a massive boulder, testing the knots 3 times. When he was satisfied, he attached the harness to the far end of the spruce beam and began the slow, controlled process of lowering it down the steep incline of the tube's floor. The wood groaned in protest, its descent echoing in the immense cavern, the sound swallowed by the deep, resonant silence. It took nearly an hour to guide the 60-foot timber to the flat, wide section of the tube he had chosen, a chamber 300 feet from the entrance, where the ceiling soared to a height of 50 feet and the walls were smooth and black, like polished obsidian. Later, by the light of a single lantern, he sat on the newly placed beam and ate his meal of dried meat and hard bread. The darkness around him was absolute, a living presence that seemed to press in on the small circle of light. Cinder lay at his feet, his head on his paws, utterly content. On a flat rock beside him lay his father's journal, open to a page of detailed cross-sections of the lava tube network. His father's handwriting was precise, architectural. The primary chamber offers a stable footprint of approximately 4,000 square feet. Ceiling height and basalt integrity are sufficient for a 2-story internal structure. Note the secondary fissure in the northeast quadrant, potential for ventilation. Kalen traced the drawing with a finger, the paper worn smooth by his parents' hands, and now his own. This wasn't a hole in the ground. It was a blueprint for survival. This was his home. The weeks bled into one another, measured not by days but by timbers moved. Each morning, Kalen and Cinder would leave the cool dark of the tube and emerge into the bright, sharp air of the mountainside. The valley below would often be shrouded in mist, the town of Cinderfall a collection of faint lights and distant sounds. He felled the trees himself, high on the northern slope where the timber was old and dense. He used a 2-man saw, working one handle himself, his body rocking in a steady, powerful rhythm that became a form of meditation. The scent of pine sap was sharp and clean. He would spend the morning limbing and cutting the logs to length, then the afternoon hauling them, one by one, to the mouth of the tube. The path he wore into the mountainside became a deep scar, a testament to his singular, relentless purpose. The townspeople grew accustomed to the sight of him, a solitary figure wrestling with impossible burdens. He became a piece of local folklore, the cave boy. Children would sometimes dare each other to creep up the path and watch, their eyes wide as he maneuvered a log that should have required 4 men. They'd whisper and run away if he looked in their direction. Mayor Hemlock made a point of riding his horse up the path one afternoon, ostensibly to inspect the town's northern watershed. He was a portly man whose authority came from his land holdings, not his wisdom. He reined in his horse a safe distance from the cave, looking down his nose at Kalen, who was meticulously sharpening the blade of his saw. "Thorn tells me you're building a house in there," the mayor said, his tone dripping with condescension. Kalen ran a whetstone along the steel, the metallic rasp the only reply. "Son," Hemlock continued, sighing dramatically, "your parents were eccentric. We all know that. But this obsession is unhealthy. There's good land in the valley. I could arrange a small plot for you, something you could farm. You could build a proper cabin made of good Cinderfall timber, out in the sun where it belongs." Kalen stopped sharpening. He looked at the mayor, his eyes clear and direct. "This is my land," he said. The parcel including the cave had been his parents', purchased for a pittance because no one else wanted it. "And this is good timber." "It's a waste," the mayor sputtered, his face turning red. "Wasting it on a damp hole that will collapse in the first big quake. You're a fool, and you're making this town look foolish by association." He pulled on his reins, turning his horse in a tight circle. "Don't come to me for help when you're starving and frozen this winter. The town has no charity for willful idiocy." The mayor rode off, leaving the scent of horse and indignation hanging in the air. Kalen went back to his work. The words meant nothing. The wood, the stone, the plan, these were the only things that were real. By the end of the first month, he had moved 50 beams into the main chamber. He began the arduous task of building the foundation, notching the massive timbers together to create a raised platform, a wooden island on the stone floor. The work was slow and precise. Every cut had to be perfect, every joint snug. The acoustics of the chamber turned each hammer blow into a percussive boom that rolled through the darkness. He worked by lantern light, often late into the night, Cinder sleeping nearby, a silent, furry shadow. One afternoon, as he was struggling to hoist a floor joist into place, a shadow fell over his work. He looked up, expecting another curious child or a disapproving elder. It was a young woman, her hair the color of autumn leaves. She held a small cloth bundle in her hands. He recognized her as Alara, Mrs. Gable's niece, who helped at the general store. She did not mock or question. She simply watched, her head tilted with genuine curiosity. "That looks heavy," she said finally. Her voice was soft, a stark contrast to the echoing hammer falls. Kaylin grunted, giving the joist a final shove into its mortise. "It is." She stepped forward, onto the edge of the wooden platform he had built. She looked up at the soaring, dark ceiling, then around at the stacks of timber waiting to be assembled. "My aunt worries about you," she said. "She says you're not eating enough." She held out the bundle. "She sent some bread and cheese." He wiped his dusty hands on his trousers and took the offering. He hadn't spoken to anyone his own age in months. He felt a strange awkwardness. "Thank you." "What is it you're building?" she asked, her eyes scanning the vast space. It wasn't the dismissive question of the mayor, but one of sincere inquiry. He hesitated, then gestured around the chamber. "A house, a workshop, a place to store food." He pointed toward a small, steady trickle of water that seeped from a crack in the far wall. "It has water, and the air is good." He showed her the fissure his father had noted in the journal, a narrow crack that led up toward the surface, creating a natural chimney. "For a stove," he explained. Alara listened, her gaze thoughtful. She touched one of the massive support pillars he had erected. It was a whole tree trunk, stripped of its bark, solid and immovable. "It's like a ship," she whispered. "A ship inside a bottle." She looked at him, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "You're not foolish. You have a plan." He just nodded, unwrapping the bread. It was still warm. For the first time, he felt a crack in his isolation, a sense that perhaps one other person in the world might see what he saw. They shared the meal in comfortable silence, the only sounds the drip of water and the soft crunch of bread. When she left, she didn't offer platitudes or warnings. She just said, "Be careful, Kaylin." The simple words and the way she used his name stayed with him long after her footsteps had faded. The work intensified as autumn painted the valley in hues of gold and rust. He framed the walls, raised the second story, and began the long process of sheathing the interior. He built rooms, a main living area, a kitchen, a workshop, and several small sleeping quarters. He constructed a massive stone hearth and chimney, venting it through the fissure. It was a monumental task, stone by stone, mortared with a clay he mixed himself from a deposit deep within the tube. He worked until his hands bled, wrapping them in rags and carrying on. He grew leaner, his body a corded mass of muscle, his skin tanned from the hours spent felling trees in the sun. Mrs. Gable clucked her tongue every time he came to the store for supplies, nails, rope, sacks of flour, and salt. "Child, you look like a ghost with dirt on it," she'd say, pressing a jar of preserves into his hands. "That cave is sucking the life out of you. There's no sun in there. It's not natural." "I'm fine, Mrs. Gable," he would say quietly. Thank you for the jam." Ilara would be there, weighing out his order. She'd meet his eyes and give him a small, encouraging smile. Once, she slipped a small packet of herbs into his sack. "For your hands," she said softly. "Steep them in hot water." It became their ritual. The town offered its disapproval, and Ilara offered her quiet support. He built furniture, a sturdy table, benches, beds. He built shelves and stacked them high with supplies, sacks of grain, barrels of salted fish, crates of dried apples, and rows upon rows of preserved vegetables. He hauled in hundreds of gallons of oil for the lamps, and wood. He dedicated a whole side chamber to firewood, stacking it from floor to ceiling until it formed a solid wall of fuel that could last for years. The sheer scale of his preparation was staggering. To an outsider, it was madness. To Kalen, it was simple arithmetic, calculations based on the data in his parents' journals. The 1883 event produced an ash cloud that precipitated a 3-year volcanic winter. Minimum sustained temperature drop of 20 degrees. Crop failure was total. He was not preparing for a hard winter. He was preparing for the end of the world as the valley knew it. By the time the first snows dusted the peak of Mount Cinder, the structure was complete. It was a house, a barn, and a fortress, all contained within the mountain's stone embrace. He had a water system, diverting the spring through a series of wooden pipes to a cistern in the kitchen. He had warmth from the great stone hearth. He had light from a dozen oil lamps. He had food to last for years. He stood on the second-story balcony he had built, looking out into the vast, dark chamber, the lantern light catching on the damp obsidian walls. Cinder sat beside him, his tail thumping softly against the wooden planks. Kalen had done it. He had taken his parents' knowledge and turned it into something solid, something real. He had built his sanctuary. The winter began strangely. The snows were heavier than anyone could remember, but it was the other signs that were more unsettling. The birds vanished. Not migrating, but gone. An abrupt and total silence falling over the forests. The deer and elk moved down from the high country weeks earlier than usual, their eyes wide with a primal fear. A faint, persistent smell of sulfur tainted the air, a scent that made the old-timers look nervously toward the mountain's peak. Mr. Thorne stopped by the cave entrance one morning, his face etched with worry. The snow was already 3 feet deep. "The well on my north pasture is running hot," he said, foregoing any mockery. "And the ground trembles at night. Just little shivers, like a dreaming dog. You feel it in here?" Kalen nodded. "I feel it." The vibrations were more pronounced deep inside the earth. Thorne looked past him, into the dark opening where a faint, warm light now glowed. He could see the edge of the massive wooden door Kalen had built, a slab of oak 6 inches thick, reinforced with iron. "You might not be as crazy as I thought," he muttered, more to himself than to Kalen. "Or maybe you're a different kind of crazy that's about to get lucky." Kalen didn't reply. He was busy securing the last of his external supplies, a sled load of iron fittings he'd had the blacksmith make. He worked with a new urgency. The mountain was waking up. The journals had described this exact sequence of events, preceded by a period of increased seismic activity and gaseous emissions, primarily sulfur dioxide. Avian and mammalian populations will exhibit evacuation behavior. He wasn't lucky. He was prepared. The first tremor that was strong enough to be felt by everyone in the valley came a week later. It was a low, violent shudder that rattled windows and sent a cloud of snow cascading from the rooftops. It was followed by a deep, guttural roar from the heart of the mountain. Panic began to ripple through Cinderfall. Mayor Hemlock assured everyone it was a minor event, a simple settling of rock, nothing to fear. He held a town meeting in the square, his voice booming with false confidence. Mount Cinder has been quiet for 500 years. It is not going to trouble us now. Go home and mind your hearths." Kalen heard the distant shouting from his perch on the mountainside. He was watching the summit. A thin, dark plume of smoke was rising from the peak, a stark black line against the gray winter sky. Cinder stood beside him, a low, continuous growl vibrating in his chest, his eyes fixed on the plume. Kalen placed a hand on his dog's back. "It's time," he said. He went inside, hauling the last of his gear with him. He checked the ventilation flue, the water cistern, the food stores. Everything was in its place. Everything was ready. Then came the ash. It started not as a fall, but as a haze, a dirtying of the pristine white landscape. The sky turned a sickly yellow-brown. Then, fine particles began to drift down, dusting the snow like gray flour. Within hours, the fall intensified. It was not like snow. It was heavy, gritty, and relentless. It fell in a thick, silent curtain, muffling all sound, turning midday into a perpetual twilight. The air grew thick with it, a choking dust that smelled of brimstone and burnt rock. It clogged the nose and throat, making every breath a painful effort. From a small, shuttered window he had built into the great door, Kalen watched the world disappear. The trees became gray ghosts, their branches sagging under the accumulating weight. The path he had worn vanished. The sky was gone. There was only the swirling, suffocating gray. The temperature began to plummet as the dense ash cloud blocked the sun. The wind picked up, driving the abrasive particles into every crack and crevice. It was no longer a snowfall. It was a scouring of the earth. He spent the first day and night in the calm, quiet warmth of his shelter. The hearth crackled merrily, its smoke drawn cleanly up the fissure chimney. The air inside was pure, the temperature a steady 60 degrees. The lamps cast a warm, golden glow on the wooden walls. He sat at his table, reading his mother's journals on botany, while Cinder slept soundly by the fire. Outside, the world was ending. Inside, there was peace. He felt a profound, sorrowful vindication. He had been right. And he had never wanted to be right more than he did now, sitting alone in his sanctuary while the people who had mocked him were choking in the dark. On the morning of the second day, he heard it. A frantic, desperate pounding on the outer door. It was a faint sound, nearly lost in the deep insulation of the rock and wood, but Cinder heard it first. The dog shot to his feet, a sharp bark echoing in the chamber. Kalen followed him to the entrance, his heart pounding in his chest. He peered through the small window. Two figures were huddled against the door, their forms nearly obscured by the swirling ash. They were covered head to foot in the gray dust, their coughing raw and ragged. It was Alara, and she was holding up her aunt, Mrs. Gable, who seemed barely conscious. Kalen heaved open the heavy door. Ash and frigid air billowed inside. He pulled the two women through the opening and slammed the door shut, the sound a final, definitive boom. He threw the heavy iron bolt. They were inside. They were safe. Alara collapsed to her knees, gasping for clean air. Mrs. Gable lay on the floor, her breathing shallow and rasping. "The roofs," Alara choked out, her voice hoarse. "The weight of the ash. They're collapsing. We couldn't breathe." She looked up at him, her face streaked with gray dust and tears. "I remembered your house. I thought, maybe." "It's all right," Kalen said, his own voice sounding strange in the sudden crisis. "You're safe here." He helped her to her feet and then knelt by her aunt. He checked her breathing, then gently wiped the ash from her face with a damp cloth. He carried the older woman to one of the sleeping rooms and laid her on a bed. He brought Alara a cup of clean water from the cistern. She drank it greedily, her hands shaking. Her eyes slowly took in the scene. The warm, clean air, the steady glow of the lamps, the massive, orderly stockpile of food and wood, the sheer, impossible reality of it. "You knew," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "You knew this was going to happen." Kaelin simply nodded, adding another log to the fire. Actions, not words. His father had always said that. Prove it with your work. They were not the last. An hour later, more pounding came. This time it was Mr. Thorne, his wife, and their 2 young sons. Thorne's face was a mask of shock and humility. His barn had collapsed, killing his livestock. His house was next. He had gathered his family and stumbled through the blinding ash storm, guided only by a vague memory of the location of Kaelin's folly. "Boy," Thorne said, his voice cracking as he looked around the vast, warm shelter. I was a fool. A blind, arrogant old fool." Kaelin just motioned for them to come toward the fire. He gave the children blankets and warm broth. There were no recriminations. There was only the shelter and the storm outside. Throughout the day, more survivors arrived. 12 at first, then 24. They came in small, terrified groups, guided by hope and the faint rumor of the crazy boy's cave. They were the blacksmith, the baker, the tanner, and their families. Each came with a story of horror, of collapsing roofs, of suffocating darkness, of a world buried alive. The final arrival was Mayor Hemlock. He stumbled in alone, his fine clothes torn and caked with ash, his face a ruin of pride and terror. His large, stately home, the symbol of his authority in the valley, had been one of the first to fall. He stood just inside the door, dripping melted, ashen snow onto the wooden floor, his eyes wide with disbelief. He stared at the 2-story house built inside a cave, at the warm fire, at the faces of the townsfolk he was supposed to lead, now huddled in the shelter of the boy he had called an idiot. He looked at Kaelin, and for a moment his face contorted as if he might speak, perhaps to offer an apology or an explanation. But no words came. He simply found a place by the wall, slid to the floor, and buried his face in his hands. Kaelin looked at the 50 souls now gathered in his home. He saw the fear, the grief, and the dawning wonder in their eyes. He had built it for himself, a shelter for one boy and his dog. But his parents' journals had also spoken of community. A single prepared individual is an anomaly. A prepared community is a civilization. He walked over to the food stores. "There is work to do," he announced, his voice carrying in the quiet chamber. "We need to organize the beds, ration the food. Everyone is welcome. Everyone must help." He was no longer the strange cave boy. He was the man who had listened to the mountain. The ash fell for 9 straight days. Outside, it accumulated to a depth of 6 feet, a thick, heavy blanket of gray death that crushed the valley. Inside the lava tube, a new society took root. Under Kaelin's quiet, steady guidance, they organized themselves. The women took charge of the kitchen and the care of the children. The men helped reinforce the entrance, build more bunks, and maintain the fire. Mr. Thorne, his farmer's pragmatism now directed by respect, became Kaelin's de facto lieutenant, organizing work crews with a gruff efficiency. Mayor Hemlock, stripped of his authority, found a new and humbler purpose in hauling water from the cistern. Kaelin moved through them all, a quiet center to their chaotic new world. He taught them what he knew. He showed them how to monitor the air quality by observing the flame of a lamp near the ventilation shaft. He showed them how to filter the ash from the melted snow to get more water. He shared his parents' journals, the pages passed from hand to hand with a reverence usually reserved for scripture. They saw the careful charts, the decades of observation, the calm scientific prediction of their current reality. They finally understood. It wasn't madness, it was knowledge. Ilara worked beside him. She organized the medical supplies, tending to the sick and injured. She was a calm, capable presence, her belief in him now shared by everyone. In the quiet evenings, after the work was done and the children were asleep, they would sometimes stand on the second-story balcony, looking out into the great, dark chamber. "You saved us," she said one night, her voice soft in the stillness. "All of us." "I built a house," he replied simply. "No," she said, turning to look at him, her eyes reflecting the warm lamplight. "You built a home. You built it big enough for everyone, even when you thought you were alone. I think you always knew." When the ash finally stopped falling, they opened the great door to a changed world. The sky was a thin, hazy blue, the sun a pale, distant disk. The landscape was an alien moonscape of rolling gray dunes, with the skeletal tops of the tallest trees poking through like broken bones. The town of Cinderfall was gone, buried completely. It was devastating, but it was not the end. The lava tube had saved them. They were alive. The recovery was slow and arduous. They lived in the tube for the entire first year. Kalen taught them how to test the new soil, rich with volcanic minerals. He showed them which deep-rooted plants had survived. That spring, they planted their first crops on the slopes near the cave entrance. It was a new beginning, a settlement born from a catastrophe, centered not around a town square, but around the mouth of a cave. They called their new home Cinderfall Refuge. Years passed. The valley slowly healed. Green returned, a vibrant, impossible green against the gray ash. The community grew, their houses built of stone and timber, many with entrances that connected to the smaller lava tubes in the network. A lesson learned and etched into their collective memory. Kalen and Ilara married. They raised their children in the house inside the mountain, a place that was both a home and a legend. Kalen never sought a title, but he was their leader. He led not with speeches, but with foresight and quiet competence. He taught the children how to read the mountain, how to understand its rhythms, just as his parents had taught him. The journals became required reading for every child in the refuge. Cinder grew old. His muzzle turned white. His steps became slow and deliberate. He spent his days sleeping by the great stone hearth, his favorite spot since that first day. One winter morning, Kalen awoke to find him still sleeping, his chest no longer rising and falling. His passing was peaceful, a gentle end to a long and loyal life. Kalen carried his old friend outside and buried him on a small rise overlooking the entrance to the tube, beneath a young, resilient pine tree that had taken root in the ash. He carved the dog's name into a smooth river stone and placed it at the head of the grave. He stood there for a long time, his hand on the stone, the silence deeper than it had ever been before. Decades flowed by like water. Kalen's dark hair turned the color of the ash that had once covered the world. His hands, once calloused and strong, became gnarled with age. He was a grandfather now, a patriarch to a thriving, resilient community. He spent his evenings by the fire, just as he always had, showing his grandchildren the worn pages of his parents' journals, explaining the seismic charts and the geological maps. He was passing the knowledge on, ensuring the lesson of the mountain would never be forgotten. He saw the same quiet understanding in his granddaughter's eyes that he had once seen in Ilara's. The legacy was secure. When his time came, it was as peaceful as Cinder's had been. He died in his bed, in the house inside the mountain, surrounded by his family. The entire community mourned him, the quiet man who had saved them all. They buried him on the rise, next to his faithful dog, under the boughs of the now mighty pine tree. They did not mourn with sadness, but with a profound and lasting gratitude. They took the largest, flattest stone they could find and placed it at the entrance to the great lava tube, the heart of their world. Mr. Thorne's grandson, now a skilled stonemason, spent a week carving the epitaph. He chose the words carefully, words that the whole community agreed were the truest measure of the man. The stone still stands there today, centuries later, the letters worn by wind and time, but still legible. Children trace the grooves with their fingers, reciting the words they all know by heart. The inscription is simple. It does not speak of a disaster or a great building. It speaks of a fundamental truth that Kalin had embodied. Kalin. He listened to the mountain. He gave us a home.